the other big story that is developing is in Egypt. The annual UN Climate Jamboree has kicked off. I'm talking about COP27. What is COP27? Well, it stands for the Conference of Parties. It is the United Nations Climate Summit that is held every year. Why 27? Because it is the 27th edition of the summit. It's happening in Sharm-el-Sheikh in Egypt this year. What happens here? Well, leaders and governments meet. They agree on steps to limit the rise of global temperatures. This year, there are three main things that world leaders are focusing on. One, of course, reducing emissions. That is something that happens every year. Two, helping countries prepare and deal with climate change. And three, very importantly, for the first time, securing funding for developing countries. This year, however, the main focus is on a loss and damage compensation agenda. This is an agenda that India has been pushing for years. What is this about? Basically, the idea is to pressurize rich nations, nations with money, the nations that are historically responsible for climate change. This includes the likes of the United States or even European Union. India, for example, has contributed less than 4% towards global warming, but we are here bearing the brunt of it. This is because climate change does not know borders or politics. It doesn't discriminate between the rich and the poor. It is an issue that affects all of us, be it the rising temperatures every year or the delayed monsoons, climate change. It's an issue that impacts every citizen in this country. The idea is very simple. Rich nations owe India and developing and people across the world, across developing nations, millions for climate loss and damage. In fact, a study is suggesting that the losses could mount to billions of dollars. So it is historical compensation that India is rallying for, and one that is in the COP's formal agenda for the very first time. Let me go straight across to Vishwa Mohan, who is joining us from Sharm-el-Sheikh. He's the environment editor of the Times of India. Vishwa Mohan, thank you very much for joining us all the way from Egypt. First things first, something new on the agenda, something big on the agenda, a compensation clause agenda. Is it likely to happen? Are nations, are the richer nations likely to agree to it? Because they can easily say, hey, what about the $100 billion we are already contributing?
Of course, that loss and damage on the agenda of the climate change is very important. But I would like to clear here that developed countries will not, I would like to emphasize on that, will not agree for the compensation and liability. What they will agree for cooperation and facilitation so that the developing countries, poor and vulnerable countries, can get some assistance, some financial assistance to adapt themselves, to prepare themselves from the disastrous consequences of climate change, that all the extreme weather events which they are facing. But putting this on the agenda of that COP27, which is the 27th edition of the Climate Change Conference, is very significant, very important. And it will take minimum 2 years to finalize the mechanism under which all the developed countries who are considered as the historical emitters, because they polluted more than any developing countries due to because they industrialized first. So they will have to provide assistance, provide some funding to the developing countries, mainly the island nation, vulnerable countries, least developed countries. Of course, India is also vulnerable. India has vast coastline. India will also be benefited, but more benefited would be the countries who are facing the brunt of it. The small Pacific nations, the island nations, least developed countries. So these countries will be benefited, but we still have time to go for finalizing the mechanism for this.
So, Vishwa Mohan, you're very clear that the richer nations are not coughing up the money in compensation. You're very clear about that. Let me ask you, just for the sake of it, is there a figure that has been put to this compensation? How much is this loss and damage compensation, worth?
No, you can't put a figure to it because it's kind of insurance. Like they will not compensate, they will not agree to the liability clause because they won't say whatever is happening, this is happening due to us. they won't agree for it. But they will certainly cooperate with the developing countries, cooperate with the least developed countries. They will provide some kind of financial assistance, but not under the compensation and liability clause. So they will not agree for it will not be their liability, it will not the compensation, it will be a kind of help, assistance, financial assistance to these countries that they will do and that they will have to do. As far as you said, as you asked whether there is some figure for it, basically figure for adaptation finance is there. Like all the developing countries are looking for the $50 billion adaptation finance out of the $100 billion per year, which the rich nations are supposed to provide. But I would like to tell you that even those amount has not come on table. The developed countries has not come out with the $100 billion promises so far. And it would be very difficult to move forward from this point when they are not even willing to provide money under the 100 billion year clause, which was agreed in 2009. So, of course, it's a positive development that they will discuss the loss and damage, but they will not accept the liabilities. That is for sure. I can tell you the first day, second day of the COP, that will not happen. What they will happen, what they will do, they will come out with a mechanism to support these countries, and that's it.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. Vishwa Mohan joining us from Sharm-el-Sheikh, the venue of COP27. Thank you very much for your perspective, Vishwa Mohan. Let's turn our focus now to Sunita Narayan, who's an environmentalist. Also, just by the way, headed to Sharm-el-Sheikh tomorrow. She's joining us on the broadcast. Thank you very much, Sunita Narayan, for being with us. In a first, one of the focuses, one of the big agendas this year is on loss funding, pressure mounting on rich nations to pay poorer nations, that have made very negligible contribution to pollution but are more vulnerable in extreme weather conditions. Do you see this being a game changer in the battle against climate change? Why is it important even to talk about it?
This is a very important moment, and let's take a moment to understand why. The fact is, we are going to COP, to the Conference of Parties on Climate Change this year, with two things. On one hand, the rich nations, the industrialized nations who have to take deep emission reductions are now finding that this winter they may return to fossil fuel. They have high energy prices. So they are now beginning, the world is not on track to reduce emissions at the scale and pace needed. On the other hand, you're seeing such devastating extreme weather events, which are breaking the back of the poorest nations, including India. And this is why the demand for loss and damage, which actually has been on the table, Shreya, from the first Conference of Party in 1992, that demand has now made its way into the COP, rightly so. The fact is, rich nations have to pay reparation and liability and have a liability for the losses that are being suffered in countries like India. We have not contributed to the stock of emissions that are in the atmosphere, nor have the vast numbers of island nations which are today suffering huge damages. So I think it's important that this moment is here. As I have written, and I believe strongly that this mechanism is not about charity, it is about reparation. And it's about the liability of polluters. If that language gets in, I think we are beginning to the world is beginning to understand that climate change requires hard, effective action.
But the question is, will the richer countries be ready to pay this compensation? I was just speaking to Vishwa Mohan, who is in Sharm-el-Sheikh, and he says there's no chance that is happening. Developed countries can simply turn around and say, hey, we are already paying you that $100 billion as climate finance already. Why should we pay additional compensation?
No, firstly, Shreya, that 100 billion is nowhere near the mark. Let's be very clear. So that 100 billion is not happened till now, and that 100 billion is an underestimation of the cost that has to be paid. Please understand, Shreya, that this is not charity that the developed nations are doing. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in 1992, essentially argued that there is a group of countries which has contributed to making a problem, and the other countries must get money and technology so that they can grow without emissions. This money, 100 billion, was to pay for that. Now, your question is very valid, that will the money be real, or will this just be another, promise that doesn't happen? I think that's a very real fear. And we must understand that the developed countries today are beginning to argue, oh, we have recession, we have inflation, we can't be paying these costs. But I think that is why the Conference of Parties this time, loss and damage, making it to the table is important, because they cannot shirk their responsibility. They cannot talk about this as just charity. They have to talk about it as something that they have to pay for because of the pollution that they have caused and the impact on countries. We have just completed a report and released it on India. India has had one disaster a day in the 9 months from January to September. One extreme weather event a day. This is not small, and this is clearly linked to climate change.
Let's talk about India and COP27. Of course, Prime Minister Modi is not going there, but India does appear to be on a strong footing to play a decisive leadership role in this summit with its success of going green and being a solar powerhouse. Now, we've made some pretty historic commitments at COP in the past. How big a role do you think India can play in tackling climate change in the future?
Very good question, Shreya. And yes, India needs to walk the talk. In fact, India needs to run the talk. And I say this with full knowledge that India has not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We do not have to take that rapid reduction as the industrialized countries do. But I believe as an environmentalist that there are co-benefits in us reinventing our energy system so that it is clean, so that it is environmentally friendly, so that it actually works for the economy and works for our health. You and I are breathing the foulest of air today in Delhi. A lot of it is because of the combustion that is happening in our industries using coal. A lot of it is because our thermal power plant standards, which were to be enforced in 2015, have not happened till now. A lot of it is because of the huge growth in vehicular population, vehicle numbers in our cities. Now, it is in our interest to reinvent mobility. It is in our interest to find ways in which we can either use gas or renewable energy, but we can do the leapfrog. Now, this will come at a cost. And India needs to make sure that we do run the talk, we do increase our level of ambition. The Prime Minister last year at Glasgow made very powerful points in terms of what India can do. We have in our national commitment that we have submitted, we have not gone as far. I think we can be more ambitious. But the Indian government is also right in saying that, listen, we can be more ambitious, but then the money and technology that we need to accelerate this phase out does not happen. Now, this is why both sides have to walk the talk. And that is why these conferences of party are so important, because there is deep distrust between the developed and the developing nations, and we need to repair it. We cannot talk about climate change without having cooperation in the world, and cooperation requires fairness and equity.
But this year, of course, COP27 is happening in Egypt, in Sharm-el-Sheikh. It's a summit that happens every year. And, people who are watching it, we will probably see some newspaper headlines, we'll see a discussion like this on TV. And it's very fair for people sitting around television or reading the newspaper to wonder, yeah, hota kya hai? What happens in these conferences? Because it's not like the extreme weather conditions are reducing, they're only increasing. And you've just pointed out to that fact. It's not like our environment is getting any cleaner. So what do all these guys who meet in far off fancy places actually end up doing about climate change? Because by the looks of it, nothing.
I think, Shreya, I stopped going to COPs some years ago. I am unfortunately going for this one day after, but I agree with you. I think the world is really out of step with the crisis that is in front of us. I mean, the Conference of Parties, I'll tell you why I still believe in them, because we have a multilateral world. And a multilateral world demands all countries to come together to discuss and to come up with solutions. The problem with the Conference of Parties, and you put your finger on it, is that these are really divorced in some senses from the reality that we are seeing in our world. And therefore, when the diplomats get together, when governments get together, when agencies get together, when civil society gets together in this huge conference, they are in a sense discussing, in my view, issues which have the horse is already bolted. We need to take action much faster. We need to show much more, it has to be much more ambitious. So you're absolutely right in asking this question. And I hope many more people will ask this question, because we need a multilateral world. We need governments to come together. We need these conferences to happen. But these conferences have to be rooted in the reality that you and I see in our world. Our world is blowing up in our own faces. And these conferences have to now ramp up action. They cannot remain talk shops and promises for another time when governments meet 1 year later.
COP sometimes becomes like the Met. It makes news for the Met Gala, that is. It makes news for who's coming and who's not coming. This year, of course, Prime Minister Modi is not going, but more importantly, Xi Jinping is not going either. China is a top polluter, and the Chinese president has decided he's simply not showing up. So does the summit mean anything without the top polluters and the emitters actually being on the table?
No, absolutely. First, the China question. China question is critical. The fact is, China's emissions are today the highest in the world, but even on a per capita basis, China will equalize with the United States in 2030. CSE is the one group which has been saying China is yesterday's United States. And the fact is, the world never came up with rules to hold big polluters to account. The US objected to it because it was the world's biggest polluter. And now that China is the world's biggest polluter, people don't know how to deal with it. But this is why we cannot talk about climate change when we have such a broken global system. You have the war. You have a situation where the Americans are not talking to the Chinese. We're dividing the world between two superpowers. How does climate change negotiations, how will the world deal with climate change negotiations in that scenario? And you're absolutely right. Climate change always takes the backseat. 2 years of COVID, back-breaking marginalization of the poorest nations, and now the war, now high energy prices in the rich countries, inflation, recession. But the fact is, Shreya, and I think that's what makes our world different. The fact is, we can't ignore the fact that extreme weather events are real, they're happening, and they're making every country in the world more vulnerable. And remember, Shreya, this is happening when temperature increase is only 1.1 degrees centigrade rise from 1870 to now. And we are talking about the fact that we are definitely on course to breach 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. So please, I mean, the only thing that I think that we as ordinary citizens of this planet have to understand, have to take some hope is that climate change cannot be ignored anymore. Whatever the crisis, climate change is here and we will have to address it. And all these small talks are not going to work. We will need aggressive action, and we will need all countries to run the talk.
Sunita Narayan, thank you very much for joining us and best of luck for your trip to Sharm-el-Sheikh. We leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much.